Okay. All right. So it's nice talk. I'm going to present about the threatened Spaldings Catchfly of the Palouse Prairie. Specifically, we're going to talk about just kind of go over the listing of Spaldings Catchfly as a federally threatened species and some of the work we've been doing here in Whitman County to help the recovery of the species. So first off, I'm just going to start with how the talk's going to go. Just kind of start out with a species description, then go into some life history of the plant, followed by why it was listed, some of the threats to the species, and then we'll kind of end it up by talking about what we've done here in the county. Spaldings Catchfly, or Silene spaldingii, was first collected by Henry Spalding, hence the name Spaldingii, around 1846 near the Clearwater River in Idaho. It is a long-lived perennial herbaceous plant in the pink family. The height ranges typically from 6 to 24 inches, but there are some that grow up to 30 inches tall. There's typically just one main branch, but it can have several branches, 2 or 3 coming off the plant. At the top of the plant, there's a 1 to 20 cream to pink flowers and a branch terminal inflorescence. The leaves are opposite. They're about 2 to 3 inches long, and they have swollen nodes at the base, which is pretty characteristic for this family. All green portions of the plant are covered in dense, sticky hairs that frequently trap dust and insects, hence the common name catchfly. And it has a persistent caudix or underground stem tissue atop a long taproot, which is 3 feet or longer. And you can see here in this picture, all the ants stuck to this plant. Like I said, it's very sticky. That's one way when they're really young, you can kind of tell what species they are just because that it'll just stick to you really well. So some life history, it's a pretty interesting plant. Typically, if everything goes well, it'll emerge in the spring and then die back to below ground level in the fall. When plants emerge in the spring, they emerge as 3 different forms, either a rosette, which is just basal leaves, a vegetative non-flowering stem plant, or a reproductive stem plant with flowering and fruiting. What makes this plant interesting is that if conditions aren't right, they may only appear above ground for a couple of weeks in the early spring and then die back below ground. They can even go dormant for 1 or more years, sometimes 3 years, which, as you can imagine, makes monitoring difficult when the plant doesn't pop out for 3 years. But the dormancy rates they vary pretty greatly between populations. Around 10% studies have shown around Craig Mountain to up to 42% and Palouse Prairie. Plants that do flower, they flower from mid-July through August typically, but it can be earlier. Some will flower as early as mid-June, and some we've even seen them monitoring into October with still a few flowers on them. Reproduction is by seed, and the fruits mature from August to September. The flowers are bisexual, but self-pollination of individual flowers doesn't usually occur because the male and the female parts are on the individual flowers at different times of year. However, different flowers from the same plant can pollinate each other. Like I said earlier, these are pretty long-lived. They can live up to 25 years. And their primary pollinator is the golden northern bumblebee. Habitat and range is pretty sporadic throughout its range, but it occurs mostly in mesic grasslands and sagebrush steppe. Although some populations are found in open pine forests, I've even heard from folks up at Turnbull Wildlife Refuge that have a population growing right out of a snowberry patch. That's a sizable population. The elevations range from 1,200 feet to 1,300 feet. It's generally found on north-facing slopes where the soils remain moist longer in the year. That way they can just have some extra moisture and they just grow better in those environments. They're found in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and there's a small population in BC. It's actually the same population as in Montana, but it just kind of drifts over the Canadian border a little bit. And like I said earlier, you can just see from this map, these are just kind of where it is. It's pretty sporadic throughout its range, but kind of the core range is kind of like around where we're at, kind of between the scablands down into the Palouse Prairie in Idaho, and then over near Enterprise, Oregon. So in 2001, it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act due to its sporadic and scarce occurrence within its native range. At the time it was listed, there was estimated to be 16,500 individual plants. By the time that the first recovery plan came around, which was in 2007, which was written by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that estimated number had gone up to 18,750 plants. And they believe that's mostly just because it was listed, there was more of an effort to go out and survey and find more of these plants. A recent 5-year review of the status of the plant came out and was written by U.S. Fish and Wildlife in 2020. And now the estimated number of individuals is over 100,000. There's 139 known populations, but most of these populations are pretty small. 2/3 of them have less than 100 individuals. The largest populations out there are the Zumwalt Prairie down in Oregon, Dancing Prairie in Montana, and Craig Mountain just south of Lewiston, Idaho. And the 2007 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan states that if recovery actions are prompt and effective, delisting might be possible by 2040. So the 2007 recovery plan that I mentioned earlier, it details the reasons for listing, known threats to the species, conservation efforts, and a recovery strategy and goals. And it splits the occurrences of the plant into 5 physiographic regions due to differences in climate, plant composition, historical fire frequency, and soil characteristics. And when this was written, it was believed that the threats to this plant would be different in those areas, and there possibly be differences in the genetics and the life history of the plant in these different physiographic regions. So here's just a map and just a description of the different regions. There's the Blue Mountain Basins down near Enterprise, Oregon, canyon grasslands, which are along kind of the major rivers in our area, the Snake, Salmon, Clearwater, Grand Ronde, and Naha, and which is in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. The Channel Scablands, that's a lot of the populations up there on BLM land and also at Turnbull Wildlife Refuge. The Intermountain Valleys of Northwest Montana, and close to home, the Palouse Grasslands, which in this publication not only includes what most of us think of the Palouse, but also the Palouse Prairie down in Idaho. So recovery criteria, one of the big things the plan talks about and what we focus on to try to recover the species is to get 27 populations, which are known as key conservation areas, with at least 500 reproducing Spaldingii or Spaldings Catchfly individuals range-wide. And those key conservation areas, what it asks for in the plan is 4 in the Intermountain Valleys in Montana, and there's currently 4. 5 within the Blue Mountain Basins, 5 within the Blue Mountain Basins, there's currently 5. 7 in the canyon grasslands, only 6 at the moment. 8 in the channeled scablands, and there's currently 6. And 3 here on the Palouse, and there's currently only 2, Septo Butte, KCA, and the Paradise Ridge, KCA. And what a lot of this literature says is that more on the Palouse might not be feasible. As you know, the habitats we have for this species and for Palouse Prairie are highly fragmented, and the possibility of finding an area that can meet this key conservation area criteria is pretty tough. That's mostly because it needs to be, this is some of the criteria for the key conservation areas. One second, I'm gonna get a sip of water here. So they need to be composed of intact habitat, mostly 40 acres in size or greater, which with the fragmentation of the Palouse Prairie we have in our area And the conversion to agriculture back in the late 1800s, there's not really many of those areas around. Another criteria for these key conservation areas is that there need to be at least 80% of the canopy cover is native vegetation. Adjacent habitats need to be sufficient to support pollinating insects, and habitat is of the quality and quantity necessary to support at least 500 reproducing individuals of Spaldings catchfly. Some more Spaldings catchfly criteria. Excuse me. The populations need to demonstrate stable or increasing population trends, and that will mean less than 10% of a chance that the population is declining for at least 20 years. And that's another part of this plan and the recovery plan, is that 20 years of monitoring is kind of necessary to delist the species. It needs to show that it's stable for 20 years. Habitat management plans need to be developed and implemented for all the KCAs. Invasive plants with the potential to displace Spaldings catchfly have to be continually controlled or eradicated within 328 feet of all populations and KCAs, or if they're really difficult to eradicate weeds, it can just be 28 feet within where those populations occur. Prescribed burning is to be conducted whenever possible to mimic historical fire regimes within a particular physiographic region and Spalding habitat. And they've done a little bit of that in the channeled scablands that I'm aware of. Seed banking occurs to preserve the breadth of genetic material across the species range, and a post-delisting monitoring program is to be developed. If all these criteria can be met by 2040, it might be possible to get the species populations improved and to get it delisted. Some range-wide threats out there to this species. Invasive non-native plants that can displace Spaldings catchfly is a real problem. And as most of you know, basically all throughout the West, and all throughout the country, have a problem with invasive non-native plants displacing our native populations that have to be controlled and managed on a regular basis. There's also other threats of problems associated with small, geographically isolated populations, such as genetic drift, inbreeding that can happen. And also these areas have there's a large perimeter around these, especially areas that are farmed, like our areas, and just the chance that, herbicide drift might come over and take out these plants is pretty high in those areas. Other threats are changes in fire regime and fire effects, land conversion associated with urban and agriculture development, pesticide spraying, especially drift in our area, adverse grazing and trampling by livestock and wildlife, off-road vehicle use, insect damage and disease, and impacts from prolonged drought and climate change. So here on the Palouse, what the recovery plan states is that of all the places where Spalding catchfly resides, those in the Palouse grasslands are the most threatened, and care is needed to maintain occupied sites and representative genetic material from these sites. Right now, there's 24 known Spaldings catchfly populations on the Palouse grasslands, and keep in mind that also includes the Palouse Prairie down in Idaho. Our largest native populations are at Kramer Prairie, where there's approximately 200 plants, and Pitt Cemetery, where there's between 60 and 80 plants. And genetic studies that recently came out show that there's little genetic difference between Spaldings catchfly populations in the Palouse grasslands, canyon grasslands, channeled scablands, and Blue Mountain basins. And this is actually good news for our populations here. And that's one of the reasons why, even if, say, we can't get to that 3 key conservation area goal, there's enough genetic diversity that's similar and where there's larger populations in these other physiographic regions that we're not really losing a lot of genetic material or genetic diversity by not having 3 populations of over 500 reproducing Spaldings catchfly in the Palouse grasslands. So some specific threats to Spaldings catchfly here on the Palouse, pretty similar to other areas, but just because of the fragmented nature of the remnants we do have of native vegetation, they're a little different. So the threats are basically similar to the threats facing Palouse Prairie remnants in general. Previous conversion to agriculture, there's little room for habitat expansion, as when there's just little dots of prairie here and there that Spalding catchfly could occur in. Most Palouse prairie remnants, they're less than 2 hectares in size, and they have a high perimeter to area ratio, meaning that it's pretty easy for there's a lot of room around it for weeds to come in or for herbicide to drift in. And these small populations are subject to loss of genetic diversity from genetic drift and inbreeding. Herbicide drift can be a big deal in our, not only to Spaldings catchfly, but to our native Palouse Prairie flora. And invasive non-native plants are also a big threat to displacing Spaldings catchfly. Especially annual grasses seem to be really taking a hold in some of these population areas, like Ventnata, cheatgrass, Japanese brome, and some other brome species. So some of the things we're doing here in Whitman County, one of our largest efforts right now is the Palouse or Septo Butte key conservation area to get 500 viable Spaldings catchfly plants in that area. So Septo Butte is the largest Palouse prairie remnant in Washington. There's 150 acres that encompass Septo State Park, and there's 437 acres of intact prairie that was purchased by a group of concerned citizens in 2016. And here on the bottom right, you can kind of see the green area. That is the private land, the 437 acres. And then outlined in yellow above that is the state park. The native population, which is on the state park land, there's approximately 20 individuals there. Besides Spaldings catchfly, there's 2 other rare plants that occur on the butte. There's Palouse goldenweed and then broadfruit Mariposa lily. There's 3 rare plant communities recognized up there. And currently the Washington DNR is in the process of acquiring the private land from the landowners for preservation as the newest natural area preserve in the state. And so here's just some of the recovery efforts we've been doing for the past few years. Palouse Conservation District received a grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And between 2017 and 2019, we've planted 1,700 Spaldings catchfly seedlings on the butte to try to get to that 500 plant goal. 500 seedlings were planted in 2017, 500 in 2018, and 700 in 2019. We've been doing all our plantings in the fall, basically because the seeds get grown out in the greenhouse in the spring and they're ready by the fall. You can see in the bottom right there, there's one of our nice good looking seedlings we got from a nursery over in near Troy. And all seedlings that we planted are put on north facing aspects, and we try to pick high quality prairie sites where we think they would do really well. We plant the seeds using a small auger, and yeah. So the first year of monitoring in 2018, we saw little to no first year survival for the plants planted in 2017. There's one of the ones we found, I think one plot, we had 2 plots. One plot we had 0% survival that year, the other we had 5. We did this monitoring, it was in October. The plant you see here is actually alive. It was one of the best looking ones that year. There's 2 main culprits for why these guys did not do well: voles and pocket gophers. And these guys kind of decimated these plants in a way. Some of these areas we could see where the plug had been in the ground, and the voles or pocket gophers just dug them straight out of the ground. And you have this nice, perfectly shaped plug hole in there where the plant was. And there's also some other problems could have been in invasive plants in those areas, but these two guys here kind of decimated things the first year. And we could see they're a little, where they're been burrowing around in the area and their activity, and they were just everywhere. So what we tried to do the next year is do something about this to keep these guys away from the plants. And what we've been trying over the past few years for all the plants we planted is using this plant skid, which is a granular herbivory repellent. And we put it on the plants when we plant them in the ground. And also we apply it about every 3 months throughout the growing season. This stuff is, I don't know if you're not familiar with it, it's non-toxic. It's made of porcupine blood, dried blood, obviously, and cow blood. And they just don't seem to like it. The voles and the moles and even deer will stay away from it, and the pocket gophers. We also tried to control invasive plants around the planting sites a little bit more. Just when we would go out and do maintenance and do monitoring, we'd pull, mostly ventnut and broma species, Japanese brome and cheatgrass out of these areas. And these efforts seem to improve our survivorship a bit. The first year survivorship of the plants planted in 2018, we had 15% survivorship in one plot and 44 in another plot. And that was, we did that monitoring in July of 2019. The bottom right, that's us out there monitoring the plants. And then in the bottom here, that's one of the seedlings from that year. So we did some more planting in the fall of 2019. And every year we kind of try to do new things and that we think will increase the chance of survival of these plants and kind of get experimental. So we tried on 250 of the plants we planted in fall of 2019. We tried these herbivory cages around all the plants. And they're basically just hydroponic pots flipped upside down and with staples put in them. And then this is an idea I got from the Spaldings Catchfly technical team meeting of that year. They'd been trying them in Montana and with some pretty good luck. So I thought, hey, let's try them too. They're not foolproof. I have seen plants in these little pots, even though we put the plant skid all the way around there when we planted them, applied it every 3 months and had these pots. Still in some of these pots, you look down there and the cages around, the pots around there, it's stapled down well, and there's still a hole where the plant used to be. And so the pocket gophers just came underneath it and just took it from underground. One other thing we did to try to control some plant competition in there is do a little shallow scalping just in the immediate vicinity before we planted. We actually found that in our previous monitoring, non-native species were having a bad effect on their survival of this, but actually native species too, where they were just kind of crowding them out. So we thought maybe doing this beforehand would help out. We also started, when we do monitoring, just kind of the more common native species, just kind of clip them a little closer, not pull them or kill them or anything. We're just clipping a little closer so that these low catchfly plants could see the light a little bit more and have a little less competition. And we also watered at planting time. This is something that was done in 2017 as well. The soil was pretty moist when we planted these guys in November, but we just thought maybe this might help. Those granular pellets we put on the ground with the plant skid, we thought a little bit of water might help incorporate that river repellent a little more. And so this year we really stepped up our monitoring. Instead of in the previous 2 years, we basically just monitored once in the summer. But this time we monitored 4 times throughout the growing season, May, June, July, and August. And it looks like with all our efforts to do some more maintenance, trying different strategies with the herbivory cages, things are paying off. It's still not great survival, but you can see from these graphs, it's a little better than it was. So up at the top right here is just, we have 7 different plots up on the butte. The first 2, that's what was planted in 2017. The next 2, 2018, and finally 2019. And we're starting to do a little better. Obviously, the plants we're doing better in May when we first looked at them, and throughout the growing season, they either go dormant or they just don't make it throughout the hot summer. So kind of extrapolating all that data, what we kind of saw is we're getting close to that 500 plant mark in May. We had, I think, 491 plants is what we had. And by the end of the growing season, we had about 250. And what I've really heard is that second year is when you really know if they're going to make it or not. So those plants that did really well this year, we're going to go back and do more monitoring next year and see how they do. And I really like using these herbivory cages. Even though I said we did have some problems with the pocket gophers, I think they did help with reducing the herbivory on these plants, at least from the above ground ones. And they also make the plants a lot easier to find when you're monitoring. And it's kind of cool to see the plants kind of grow up through the cages to the point that you have to take them off. It makes, it makes you feel like you're actually doing something and they're actually growing. And the left here, that's just a 1-year plant and it looks really good. So in addition to working at the Septo Butte KCA, we've also been doing some work at some smaller populations, particularly 2 pioneer cemeteries here in the county. Wheelan Pioneer Cemetery, which has approximately 20 Spaldings Catchfly plants, and then Pitt Pioneer Cemetery, which has between 60 and 80 individuals. If you're not familiar with the pioneer cemeteries, so they're really great remnants, actually, for the most part, especially these 2. They're really high quality remnants. And they were never plowed because the early white settlers planted their relatives in there, and they're not going to plow up a cemetery. So some threats, there are threats though to these populations here. Like I talked about with the small areas and the small little remnants, these both are a couple acres in size. There's a pretty big issue with herbicide drift from the adjacent farmlands. And we've done some work to try to mitigate that, which I'll get to in a little bit. There's also non-native invasive weeds in these areas. Picture to the right, that's Pitt Cemetery here this past fall. And a few years ago, it was actually getting mowed, and the mowing kind of spread the weeds around, and it's more weedy now than it used to be, but that's since ceased. Another issue that there was in the past, but there's been some work done to alleviate this, is off-road vehicle use in these areas. So at Wheelan Cemetery, this is a picture from, I think, June 2019, when everything's in full bloom up there. So there's been a lot of weed control efforts by the Palouse Prairie Foundation and Palouse Conservation District. Palouse Prairie Foundation did a large-scale removal of lilacs this year in those areas. They hired a crew to come in and basically take chainsaws and take out the lilacs. The lilacs are really pretty, and they were planted by the relatives of the people who were buried in the cemetery when they were first buried there, because they reminded them of home and it looked nice. But over the years, the lilacs, they've really suckered everywhere, and which suckered, I mean, the little shoots come up under the ground and more plants grow. And they've really expanded throughout these areas, and they've shaded out the native plants and grown over the gravestones. We went in a couple of years ago, just with some loppers, and uncovered some gravestones in a big area that probably hadn't seen the light of day in 30 years. And that was cool to go in and find something, actually, kind of uncover some history in these areas. In addition, also the Palouse Prairie Foundation, once a year, they have volunteers come out and they have a little weed pulling party. And they also have volunteers that come out throughout the growing season and pull weeds. to keep the weeds out of there. So fencing was with another grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Fencing was installed in 2018 around the north and the east side of the cemeteries to prevent off-road vehicle use through the area. There was a native grass buffer planted around the east side to help intercept any herbicide drift that could be coming into the area. And there's also been ongoing monitoring of the catchfly population there for the past few years. At Pitt Cemetery, kind of the similar threats there. We've been doing some ongoing weed control every year, especially to control the lilacs. There's some catchfly plants that are growing right out of the lilacs through there. There's an area with a lot of little suckers coming up, and we just mow it every year and they come right back. But we try to wait to mow till after the catchfly plants in there have done their thing and gone to seed. And the catchfly population there is actually looking pretty good. We had some really robust looking plants, and every year we find, I've been finding more out there in the past 2-3 years. I've been monitoring out there. Another thing we've been controlling is white briny, which has been growing up on some of the trees and the fencing that was put in there. Hound's tongue is another thing we've been dealing with. And then just our kind of regular invasive too. We'll pull up some non-native annual grasses too every now and then. And this place, there was also fencing installed on the east side of the cemetery in 2018 to prevent off-road vehicle use, and also just looks really nice. There's some interpretive signs that were put in also to inform visitors about the native plants in the area and also some of the history. And we've also been doing monitoring every year of the catchfly population in that area. So these efforts we've been doing at Septo Butte and Pitt and Wheelan Cemetery, they're not only helping recover Spaldings catchfly, but they're also just protecting Palouse Prairie remnants. So any efforts we've been doing to help the catchfly are also helping all these other rare and endemic plants of the Palouse. Especially Palouse goldenweed seems to be in all these areas, Palouse thistle. And yeah, there's ongoing efforts, these weed control efforts. It's kind of, you're getting a dual effort by not only protecting the catchfly, but also the remnants. And with that, I guess I'll leave it open for some questions.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Yeah, we have a couple questions. So first off, can you talk about what efforts are underway to recover the Spaldings catchfly in other parts of its range?
Yeah, so a lot of efforts. Just over into Idaho, Latah Soil and Water Conservation District have been working a lot at the Paradise Ridge KCA over there. And they've been trying all kinds of stuff, experimental things. They've been planting seed a lot using a Truax drill and just trying to drill seed into some CRP land to see if you can get some catchfly to grow there, and then monitoring it. They've also been doing similar things to us, and they've been doing it longer than us, planting a lot of seedlings up there. Some other efforts they've been doing, a lot of the other areas, they have bigger native populations than we have, especially down the Zumwalt Prairie, and then over into Montana, and even down in the canyon grasslands. And a lot of their work down there is it's monitoring and try to get this trend monitoring, this 20-year long trend monitoring, which we haven't started yet because we don't have that many plants. And yeah, so, and also they've done experiment with some fire around, especially the scablands, try to see how that works.
Awesome. Sounds like a lot of work going into it. Molly asked, will the US 95 expansion affect recovery efforts on Paradise Ridge? I
don't know. That's a question for Latah Soil and Water Conservation District.
Okay. Let's see, we have some other questions. Nancy asked, can those of us who have native gardens grow it from seed?
You can try, for sure. It's the literature out there and there's actually some good papers I could actually send her on how to grow it out. It needs about, if I remember correctly, it needs about an 8-week long cold stratification period before you can grow it. But from what I've heard, we usually get native seed nurseries to grow it out. There was a nursery in Troy that was growing it for a while. Thorn Creek Native Seeds down in Genesee has been growing it out, and BFI over in Moses Lake. From what I hear, it's not too difficult to get started, but it does really do well from that cold stratification period of about 8 weeks before you start growing it.
Awesome. And Nancy, you will get Anthony's email after the talk. So if you do want to get those materials, you will have his contact info. So Ryan asked, are more frequent fire returns particularly beneficial? And what does an ideal fire regime look like in this community type?
Ooh, that's a really good question. In the Palouse, we haven't really been focusing on it. We just have such small areas. It's just not feasible for us to go burn Septo Butte or some area like that. Other parts of like the channeled scablands where they've been trying it, I think they've tried it down in the canyon grasslands too a little bit. I really don't know because it's not something we deal with in this area. So sorry, I can't really answer that one very well.
Okay, fair enough. Another question, do the sticky hairs on Spalding's Catchfly that can trap insects and other debris give it any type of advantage? Does it gain anything from trapping insects?
I don't know if it necessarily gains anything from the insects. What has been speculated though that I've read out there is that the little hairs will kind of, especially kind of later in the season when the seed's ripe, can kind of stick to animals and stuff that goes by it, which, you know, can carry those plants and help disperse the seeds in other places. The seed dispersal on these plants is pretty, they don't disperse seeds over a wide area. There's kind of wind blown, and the seeds they have little wings on them, but they don't get around well, I guess. So yeah, it is speculated that does help. And I've noticed when we've been monitoring like late in the season, September, October, you'll touch a plant and it'll just, you know, it's gone to seed and it'll just kind of break off in your hand to stick there. So it's trying to use me and my other monitoring folks as a mechanism for seed dispersal. So it is speculated that is one way that the stickiness helps it.
Okay, awesome. Someone asked, is it possible for fields that have already been converted to agriculture to one day be restored back to Palouse Prairie?
Oh, definitely. I know there's a lot of folks around that have been experimenting and doing some pretty successful jobs with that. Eastern Washington University they've been doing a huge project up there to convert a lot of ag fields. Over in Latah County, there's been a lot of folks that have converted old ag fields. In the Midwest, they do it all the time, convert stuff back to tall grass prairie. And yeah, it's difficult. It's very hard. It takes a long time. It's a lot of weed control is your main thing you gotta deal with, but it's definitely possible. And I've seen some really great looking reconstructed prairies.
Okay, awesome. And then Ronnie said, I have patches of Douglas's catchfly on my hillsides in Union Flat Canyon below Clemgard Park. Does that relate to your efforts with the Spaldings catchfly?
They're similar. They're different species, but yeah, they're similar, the same plant family. I know early in the season, they can be easy to mix up, especially I've done that monitoring before and I had to take a second look. Yeah, but it doesn't really relate to my efforts, but they're very closely related.
Awesome. And then Kaylin asked, you mentioned seed banks at the beginning and the importance of genetic diversity for these populations. Do you know what the process would look like to utilize those seed banks or to identify which genomic traits might be advantageous in the midst of changing climate and other stressors?
Oh, that's over my my level to answer. I speculate these areas that are a little drier might have some more advantageous traits than other areas. Like, so the genetic studies that were done found that the ones in the main range from the prairie grasslands, excuse me, the canyon grasslands up to the scablands were pretty genetically similar, but the ones over in Montana were pretty different. Especially, I think it's called Lost Trail KCA, which is over in Montana. They have over 500 plants there, but they're trying to plant more and to do increase population there, because it was actually found that those plants were pretty genetically different than anything else. So it might be advantageous with climate change is these areas of lower elevations, like around Craig, Low and Craig Mountain, and over in the canyon grasslands, they could, potentially hold some future because they can adapt and they do better in those drier environments.
Awesome, cool. And then we'll see if anyone else has any other questions. I saw someone asked about volunteering opportunities. So with the Palouse Conservation District, we of course love our volunteers, rely on you. Our opportunities are limited right now due to COVID, but the Palouse Prairie Foundation might have some opportunities available with those prairie recovery efforts. And Elizabeth lists an opportunity above. So definitely get in contact if you are interested in that. And let me just look and see what else, if there's anything else in here. We have a lot of great discussion on fire return intervals on the Palouse. Let's see. Oh, Sarah asked, have you worked with people whose families are buried in those cemeteries to understand protecting Palouse remnants versus sentimental plantings like lilac?
So we have run in, I don't know if we've ever run into folks that are related to those people. I definitely, one of our board members came out when we were cutting stuff down, and she's many generations on the Palouse and farmed here, and she knew some folks there, but she wasn't directly related to them. And actually most folks, especially, will be sitting there on a lunch break or something outside of Wheelan Cemetery, they stop and wonder what we're doing there, and they're pretty happy with what we're doing, especially when we start telling them about, oh, we found these, we cut 20 feet into this patch of lilacs, and we found all these gravestones that probably haven't seen the light of day in 30 years, and they're pretty happy about it. And a lot of we've done at Pitt Cemetery, especially, is we're just like trying to control them. We're not trying to take them all the way out there. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing. Yeah, and people are pretty happy about it. Yeah, for the most part.
Okay, awesome.
Haven't had anyone get mad, so
that's good. And then I think we have another question. What kind of pollinators pollinate the catchfly?
So the main one is are bumblebees. The Voles ferretus. Sorry, I probably butchered that one. I don't know I'm not a pollinator guy, but so bumblebees. That's the main one. Some kind of speculative evidence out there. It suggests that also some solitary bees pollinate them. There's been one wasp that's people thought, they see it buzzing around it and just thought they might pollinate it. And then in Oregon, they saw a night pollinating moth one time on one of the plants. So.
Awesome. And I think we'll do one more question. So Josh asked, are there any other pioneer cemeteries beside Pitt and Wheelan that offer potential for Spaldings catchfly plantings around the region?
Oh yeah, there's quite a few around. Yeah, they're not. Those are probably the highest quality areas for sure, at least that I know of, that have been to. But there's a few others that could be potential. They're kind of dotted all over the area.
Yeah.